In March of 2013, lead vocalist Chris Torpey of an Australian post-rock band would tragically pass away from a suicide. The remaining band members would take a long break, and in 2015 they would return and release their first ever fully instrumental album, and the album I want to talk to you about today, Departure Songs by We Lost the Sea. Hello everyone, thank you for clicking on this video. If you're like me and you love music and you love learning about and discussing music, then stick around because this is an album that I don't see a lot of people talking about on YouTube, and I think it's a shame because, as I said before, I think this is a masterful work of art that you should listen to. In this video, I want to first talk about my personal experience with this album and why I think it's so great, and then later get into some of the more fascinating backstories behind each of the songs. I first discovered this album as a YouTube recommendation. I saw the album cover and I thought it looked cool, and so I put it on. I am a connoisseur of attractive album covers. At least I like to think so. I initially just put it on as background music while I did something else, but I was immediately distracted by it, and I couldn't help but just become enthralled with the rest of the experience. Now, if you're unfamiliar with post-rock and you don't really know what that is, I don't either. I'm not very good with defining musical genres. I just see what everyone, calls them and refers to them as. I would compare this album to the works of This Will Destroy You, God is an Astronaut, maybe Mogwai. So if you're a fan of any of those bands, then I think this will be right up your alley. This album has 5 tracks, 4 songs, considering that the last 2 tracks are a part 1 and 2, and each of them has a historical event attached to them, a story of sacrifice and loss, and that's a theme that kind of just surrounds this whole album, which makes sense considering the loss of their lead vocalist. The band member certainly had a lot of, grievance on their mind, and you can hear that pouring out of this album at times. But as I stated before, I went into this pretty much blind. I didn't know any of that. It was just a post-rock album to me. And for that reason, I want to just discuss the sonic elements first, and then we'll get into the fun historical events later. The opening track, A Gallant Gentleman, is the shortest track on the album, and I think it works fantastically well in introducing us to the mood this album is going to carry throughout. When the song starts, we hear an incredibly lonely and isolated guitar tone. This thing has a lot of delay over it, and it gives us this sense that we're stranded and alone somewhere. And the second layer of guitars that the song slowly starts to add to it gives us this sense that, something's going to happen. Like we're about to pass on to the next life. And that sense is, honed when halfway through the track, these incredibly heavenly and chill-inducing vocals kick in. It kind of sounds like we can see the gates of heaven opening in the distance, but we're not quite there yet. We still have to crawl our way up there. The really somber ostinato that's been repeating throughout the song starts to add more guitar layers. The guitar textures start to sound more distorted. The drums start building, and we hit this massive crescendo where the vocals start swelling and the guitars just create this wall of sound, and that melody just reaches this climactic moment of release. This sounds like the moment that we are finally lifted off of our plane and we're ascending into those gates. When the crescendo first starts to die down, the guitars start fading out and we hear the vocals and they sound more distant, far away, almost like now we're not the person who just passed away, but instead we are the people that witnessed it, and we're watching those gates close with this person on the other side. This song is titanic, it is chill-inducing, and I think it's a great way to pave the road for where we're going to go in the next 4 tracks. The second track, Bogatiri, starts with another very somber but a little more eerie sounding guitar strumming, and eventually this builds into what I can only consider a march, almost like we're no longer isolated, we're among a group of people, and yet we are heading towards something that we're just quite not ready for. As the steady percussion keeps pushing us onward, they start to add more layers of guitars, very similar to the last track, only now, instead of it feels like we're ascending and we're releasing, it feels like we're heading into fire. Which is not just metaphorical fire, because what this builds up to is fantastic. The guitars start to get more distorted, the tempo starts to rise, and the drums get more complex, and this almost becomes a post-metal song for a little bit. We even get a little bit of tremolo picking on the guitars, which sounds like something that should be on a black metal song. Yeah, the build-up on this thing is fantastic, and it's definitely one of the heavier moments of the album. It's very raw, it's very angry, and what you'll hear about later, given the story behind this song, it makes sense. As the track starts to die down, we get this really thick fog of high-end distortion. It pops up a few times on this album, and I really, really like this. It's really atmospheric. It sounds like you've just witness something that you can't believe, and so you start to like disassociate. Your mind goes outside of you for a little bit. When I first heard this album, the next track, The Last Dive of David Shaw, was the point where I realized this wasn't just, this isn't just some epic sounding post-rock music. There's something a little more sinister to this thing. The track opens with this really eerie drone and what sounds like metallic breathing. It sounds muffled and claustrophobic. As the distortion grows and grows to an almost uncomfortable level, we then go into an incredibly oceanic guitar tone. This thing sounds like we are alone at the bottom of the sea, which would make sense given that even if we don't know the historical context of the song, The Last Dive of David Shaw, it kind of, puts that image in your brain. The percussion kicks in and it's almost this waltz type of beat and tempo. The guitars start to pile in on each other, and the melody makes it sound like we're slowly being surrounded by something that we can't escape from. However, unlike the previous build-ups, this one cuts out suddenly. It's very uncomfortable almost, and we get this guitar that almost sounds like a sonar, and when the new melody starts to kick in and build us up again, it sounds more, determined. It sounds like we're persevering through something. Like whatever sinister thing was surrounding us for the first 5 minutes of the song, we're not going to let it stop us from achieving our goal. We're then treated to one of the greatest build-ups in the entire album, as the guitars ramp up and up in their distortion, and they just start layering on top of each other. The drums start to go into this full, just pure epic post-rock groove. There's even a very 80s sounding keyboard buried under the mix at one point, which I really appreciate. This is one of the most epic and triumphant moments on the album, but of course we have to eventually die back down, and this song ends with one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard. This piano piece is so serene. It gives me this sense that we have accepted our grief, we've come to terms with it, and we're just watching all of that burden that we've been carrying just float away from us. It's really powerful, and it could be my favorite moment on the entire album. Finally, we reach the last two tracks, Challenger Part 1, Flight, and Part 2, A Swan Song. And again, when I first heard this album, I had no idea about the historical context, but when I reached this track, it was pretty obvious what this was dedicated to. Part 1 opens up with this incredibly ominous drone with these occasional guitar strums that just it sounds like an avalanche just rolling over the track. And we are treated to a field recording of William S. Burroughs' speech on dreams. I'm a big fan of field recordings being used in post-rock music. My favorite band being Godspeed You Black Emperor, prime example. and I feel like they would be proud of this. Barreau talks about how the brain waves when a person is asleep and dreaming are very similar to the brain waves when they go into space. Very interesting stuff, and it paves the road for what will eventually come at the head of this track. After this, we transition into more dissonant and isolated guitars with this occasional, very tense melody creeping up in the background every now and then until the drums kick in, and then it's full-blown anxiety. This section it sounds like we're running from something. However, this doesn't build up into a full-blown crescendo. The track actually slows down a little bit, and we get this really weepy, distorted guitar that is just like singing this really just painful melody, almost like a reflection of all of the loss that we've experienced so far, before dying down, and now we're building again. The track starts this Eye of the Tiger type of plucking. A synth starts to creep its way from the background to the foreground of the track, and when all the guitars come in strumming, it really paints this motivating and just persevering nature of the song. And paired with the barely audible radio broadcast that we hear buried in the mix, it sounds like this track is getting ready for a launch. When the drums kick in, it's all toms. It sounds very industrial, and the guitars just keep ramping up and layering and layering and layering over each other. Different melodies take over the foreground of the mix. The tempo keeps increasing, and man, it is an absolute rush. But it can't last forever. An even more distorted version of that painful guitar we heard earlier in the song creeps its way back up, and this thing is just shrieking over it as the track gives one final explosive measure. It dies down, and we hear one of the most harrowing things I've heard in music ever. Later on, when we discuss the historical event that the track is based off of, this section is going to hit a lot more hard, but even listening to this, not fully knowing what the context was, I still felt like sad. We hear crowds of people like weeping and confused, asking why, like why did this happen? Giving this like overwhelming sense that we just lost something huge. That thick fog of high-end distortion creeps back up here. The guitars start to fade away, and a really, really gut-wrenching violin creeps in. The voices in the crowd start to become more prominent in the mix, and the radio voice we've been hearing throughout the build-up does as well. This is just it's such a unique thing to post-rock. Like, there's just not a whole lot of styles of music that can take the time to induce this type of atmosphere in the listener, and I love it, and it's something that, you gotta experience. We finally reach the final track, part 2 of Challenger, a swan song, and if you've felt like this album has been just a total downer the whole time, well, we've got some good news. This is a more uplifting moment to end on. The progression on this track sounds incredibly warm. It sounds safe. It feels like, after the first 4 tracks, we've just been beaten down, and now there's someone like picking us up and telling us it's okay now. As the drums start to slowly build up into our last crescendo, it sounds so uplifting and triumphant, and I love this like walking up and down melody that the guitar starts playing at this one point. I don't know, it was stuck in my head for a long time. As the album draws to a close and the music starts to fade out, we're treated to one last recording of a speech, and it's one that I think just perfectly, ends the album on, a relatively high note, despite how much, pain has been experienced throughout these tracks. We're left feeling, hopeful. And I think that's a much needed feeling after such an intense and, dare I say, harrowing experience. So that was Departure Songs by We Lost the Sea. And over the years, this album has only grown more and more important to me, due in no small part as to researching what the topics of each of these songs are about. And that's what I want to discuss now, because I also love history, and some of these are about points of history I didn't know much about. As I stated at the beginning of this video, this album was birthed out of the grief of the other band members having lost their vocalist, and they specifically chose these historical instances of someone sacrificing themselves for, the greater good or for the sake of their friends. That's why I hesitate to just put this album on as a pleasant listening experience, because I feel like it's something that deserves reverence. Not just for their late band member, but for each of the lives that were lost in the historical stories I'm going to share with you now. A Gallant Gentleman is in reference to Captain Lawrence Oates, who was part of a British team in 1911 who vowed to find the South Pole. However, during their grueling and freezing journey, they discovered that someone else had already reached it first, so they turned around, but they were met with insurmountable weather, and they were low on provisions, and Oates in particular was very, very not doing well. And he asked them to leave him behind so that the rest of them could make it back to safety, as he was only slowing them down. When they refused, one night, Oates got up out of his tent and walked into the freezing, black, cold night, where he was never seen again. The only note he left for the rest of his crewmates were, "I'm going out and I may be sometime." This ended up saving their lives, as they no longer had to care for him. They were able to make it back to civilization. Earlier in the video, when I was describing the track, I used all these terms like isolation and loneliness, followed by a sense of ascending. I believe that these are things that the band captured very well of what Lawrence Oates' final moments were probably like. Choosing to leave his tent and venture out into the freezing cold blackness and succumbing to a slow passing is something only the bravest of souls would ever be able to do. Bogatiri is actually a story I had heard before, although I did not know that this song was about that. After the severe Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986, they needed plant workers to venture into the heavily radiated basement of the facility in order to open a water gate. This would prevent a second explosion from happening, which would endanger millions of lives. However, it was widely believed that anyone they sent down there, they were sending to their doom. Despite this, 3 plant workers volunteered for the job. These 3 plant engineers, and forgive me if I mispronounce, were Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bespalov, and Boris Baranov, although all 3 of them were known as the Suicide Squad. Like a lot of people, I first learned about this story through the excellent HBO miniseries Chernobyl, and if you remember that scene, you remember how absolutely tense it was. And that's something that I think that the second track, Bogatiri, captures perfectly. That incredibly angry and adrenaline-fueled buildup, I think, is a perfect way to represent the intensity and frustration of the situation, because these men were sacrificing themselves to clean up the messes of some higher ups that just didn't care. However, if you also watch that Chernobyl series, you may also remember at the end that the 3 didn't actually initially die. In fact, all 3 survived very, for a long time after the incident. But it was the very fact that they believed it would kill them, and yet they still volunteered to do it, that I think is still worthy of recognition. By far the most uncomfortable story for me to research was The Last Dive of David Shaw, especially because that recording of breathing you heard at the beginning of the track, Yeah, that was real. That was the final breaths of David Shaw. David Shaw was one of only 10 people throughout history who have dove into the depth of 250 meters. More people have walked on the surface of the moon. A young man named Dion tragically passed away in the, forgive me if I mispronounce, Boesmensgat freshwater cave. David, upon exploring the cave, discovered the body and wanted to return it to his family. After a long time of planning, and with the entire diving community behind his back, David had hatched a plan to get the body out of the cave. They even did like multiple practice runs in other bodies of water to make sure it was doable. However, down in the dark blackness of the cave, David tragically never made it out. Trying to attach a rope to the body as it was floating around him, it eventually meant that David himself got tangled and trapped at the bottom of this cave. They were able to pull Dion's body out, but David never made it. And I like swimming, but I have an intense fear of drowning. So learning about that, especially learning that the breathing we hear at the beginning of the track are David's final breaths, it adds a whole extra layer of nope to that song. Despite the fact that I still think it's absolutely incredible. And yeah, that's a real tough one to learn about. And finally, there's Challenger, the story that I'm sure most of you know about already. I myself knew of it, but hadn't done thorough research on it, so it was interesting to learn more about. The space shuttle launched with 7 passengers and exploded only 73 seconds after launch. Aboard the Challenger were 6 astronauts and 1 school teacher who volunteered to be aboard the ship in order to teach her students about space. The radio broadcast that we hear during the track is the real-life audio of the radio broadcaster covering the launch of the Challenger. Likewise, all of the terrified reactions of the crowd are also real-life recordings of a crowd that was watching the Challenger offshore blow up right in front of their eyes. I particularly lock on to the voice at the end that says they were here and now they're gone. That's become an almost tagline to this album for me. It's a sentence that was said right in the midst of panic and confusion, but I think it just carries so much poetic weight to the idea of losing someone and just how temporary, life here is. As a Christian myself, I do believe in an afterlife. I do believe that, through following God and His Word, we'll be with Him in heaven. But I know that there are people that don't, and, to some people, it's nothing after death, or they just don't think about it. Despite that difference, though, I think one thing that a lot of us, if not all of us, agree is that legacy is important to us. When we think about leaving, we think about, who's going to remember me when I'm gone? Who's going to, what are they going to remember about me? And these are souls, these men and women in this album, these are people that I think achieved the highest, level of legacy in a way. Because in these situations that ended so tragically for them, they knew the risks. They knew what they were, getting themselves into, and yet they still took it head on for the greater good. And I think that this album is just a beautiful and, very respectful way of honoring them. And as a piece of epic music, I think it's fantastically enjoyable as well. So to the band, We Lost the Sea, I say thank you. And if you made it all the way to the end of this video, thank you for watching. This is something that's new to me. I don't really make videos like this. You can probably tell on my channel it's pretty barren. I just kind of make memes or whatever every now and then. But like I said, this was a topic that I haven't really heard a whole lot of people discuss on YouTube, and I figured, hey, I love this album, and I love talking about music, and I annoy the crap out of my friends whenever I talk about music endlessly, so I figured, hey, why not make it into a video, and just see what happens. Whether you are one of, a few hundred people that sees this, or one of only 5 people that sees this, if you didn't know about this album and I had the chance to make you aware of it, and even better yet, if you check it out and you like it, then I feel good about this. If you'd like to see more stuff from me, leave a like and a comment. Or if you want to discuss anything that I talked about in this video, or anything else retaining to it, then yeah, would love to see you in the comments as well. So yeah, that's about it. Thank you for watching again, and have a blessed day.